My husband insisted on a split budget the moment he became a millionaire, but I didn't realize he was actually using it to frame me for his multi-million-dollar crimes. It wasn't until I found $4 million hidden inside our organic milk that I realized my empowered marriage was a high-stakes death trap. I never thought I'd be the woman standing in the middle of aisle 4 staring at a carton of organic, grass-fed milk like it was a declaration of war. But there I was, gripping the handle of a grocery cart that felt heavier than our entire 3-year marriage. My husband, Mark, was several paces ahead of me, tossing a wedge of aged Pecorino Romano into the basket without even looking at the price tag. It was $42 for cheese. To understand how we got to this point, you have to understand who Mark used to be. When we met, we were both scrappy. We shared ramen in my cramped studio apartment and celebrated my first promotion with a bottle of $12 sparkling wine. We were a team. Our money was always the mindset. But 3 months ago, Mark landed a senior director role at a tech firm. His salary didn't just increase, it doubled. Along with that jump in income came a sudden, sharp interest in quote _4 _. He sat me down one Tuesday night, 2 sets of spreadsheets printed out and laid across our mahogany dining table. He told me that now that he was quote 5, it was only fair that we protected our individual assets. He proposed a quote 6. We would each contribute a set percentage of our income to a joint account for the mortgage and utilities, but everything else, our hobbies, our clothes, our personal savings, and our daily expenses, would be completely separate. He had said, leaning back with a glass of expensive scotch I hadn't seen him buy, "You keep what you earn. I keep what I earn. No more asking permission to buy a new pair of shoes or a gaming console. We're adults. We should have our own buckets." I was hesitant. I'm a freelance graphic designer. My income is stable, but it's nowhere near his new tier. However, I didn't want to seem like I was clinging to his coattails. I wanted to be that empowered, independent wife he was talking about. So I agreed. I shifted my direct deposits, we set up the joint account for the house, and I thought that would be that. I was wrong. The first week, it was small things. Mark would ask me to pick up his dry cleaning on my way home. When I'd ask for the $20 it cost, he'd wave me off. "Just put it on your card, babe. I'll get the next thing." But the next thing never came. Then came the dinners. We'd go out, and when the bill arrived, he'd suddenly be very busy checking an urgent work email. I'd end up sliding my card over, watching my personal bucket drain while his stayed overflowing. But the grocery store was where the real battle lines were drawn. Under our new agreement, daily expenses were separate. To Mark, this apparently meant that since I was the one who usually did the meal planning and the actual physical act of shopping, the bill was my expense. For the first month, I swallowed it. I bought the chicken, the vegetables, the coffee, and the laundry detergent. I watched him eat the meals I cooked, using the ingredients I paid for while he talked about the new high-end mountain bike he'd just pre-ordered for $6,000. The resentment started as a slow simmer, but by this Saturday morning trip to the store, it was a rolling boil. "Oh, pick up those Wagyu sliders, too," Mark said, pointing toward the meat counter, "and those imported olives. I'm thinking of having the guys over for the game tomorrow." "The guys?" I asked, my voice tight. "That's 5 people, Mark, including you. That's a lot of sliders." "Yeah, well, I want to host properly. First time they're seeing the new place since the renovation. It's a big deal." I looked down at the cart. It was overflowing. There was top-shelf bourbon, artisanal crackers, 3 different types of expensive berries that were out of season, and the aforementioned $42 cheese. My mental calculator was spinning. This trip was easily going to top $400. My entire grocery budget for the month was $500. "Mark," I said, stopping the cart near the deli section, "we need to talk about the total here. This is a lot of stuff that isn't on my list. If you're hosting the guys, maybe you should grab this half of the cart on your card." He stopped and turned, a look of genuine confusion, or a very good imitation of it, on his face. "What do you mean? We agreed. We do our own thing. But you're the one shopping. I'm just helping you pick stuff out." Helping me pick stuff out for your party? I countered. Mark, I've paid for every single meal we've eaten in the house for the last 5 weeks. I've paid for the toilet paper you use, the soap you wash with, and the steak you had last night. My bucket isn't as deep as yours, and it's starting to hit the bottom. He let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind he used to use for difficult clients. Sarah, don't be like this. It's petty. We're talking about groceries. I pay 60% of the mortgage now because my contribution is higher. I'm already carrying the heavy lifting. Are you really going to nickel and dime me over some olives? It's not just olives, and you know it. It's the principle of the split budget you insisted on. If it's separate, it's separate. Fine, he snapped, his jaw tightening. If you want to be fair, then be fair. I'll pay for the sliders, but I expect you to handle the rest of the household stuff like we discussed. It's part of the living expenses you agreed to manage in exchange for me covering the bulk of the housing costs. I felt a sting of betrayal. We'd never agreed to that. He had framed the mortgage split as a proportional contribution based on income, not a trade-off for me becoming his unpaid personal shopper and caterer. But I didn't want to cause a scene in front of the guy slicing the prosciutto. I went quiet, pushed the cart to the checkout, and watched the numbers climb. $112, $240, $385. The final total flashed on the screen, $462.88. The cashier looked at me expectantly. I looked at Mark. He was staring at his phone, leaning against the candy rack, completely detached. Quote 29, the cashier asked. I took a deep breath. I reached into my purse, but I didn't pull out my debit card. I pulled out my phone and opened our joint banking app, the one for the mortgage. I saw the balance. It was exactly what it needed to be for next week's payment. Then I looked at Mark's personal credit card, which he had accidentally left on the kitchen counter that morning and which I had tucked into my pocket to give back to him later. I held his card in my hand, feeling the weight of the metal. I looked at him and then back at the cashier. Actually, I said, my voice trembling slightly, we're going to need to split this transaction exactly down the middle. Mark looked up from his phone, his eyes narrowing. Sarah, don't start. I'm not starting anything, darling, I said, a cold smile spreading across my face. I'm just following your rules. My money for my food, your money for yours. I handed the cashier his card. Run the first $231.44 on this one. Mark stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Wait, you can't use that card. Why not? I asked. It's yours, isn't it? From your tier? Because, Mark hissed, leaning in close so the cashier wouldn't hear. Quote 41. I froze. Maxed out? Mark made nearly $300,000 a year. We had no debt other than the mortgage. How could his personal card be maxed out? I looked at him, searching his face for a joke, but all I saw was genuine cold panic. Behind us, the line was growing. People were starting to mutter. Quote 42, I whispered. Quote 43. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and grabbed my wrist, his grip tighter than it had ever been. Put the card away, pay for the groceries. We are leaving now. But I didn't pull out my card. I looked down at his phone, which was still unlocked in his other hand. A notification popped up on the screen, a message from an app I didn't recognize. It said, your second installment is overdue. Secure the assets or the contract is void. My heart dropped into my stomach. What contract, Mark? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The cashier cleared his throat loudly. Is there a problem here? Mark didn't look at the cashier. He looked straight at me, and for the first time in 10 years, I realized I was looking at a total stranger. Quote 47, he said. I stood there for a moment, the heat of the grocery store's fluorescent lights feeling like a spotlight on my humiliation. The cashier was pretending to be very interested in the barcode of a cereal box, but I could see the twitch in his jaw. Mark's hand was still clamped around my wrist, a physical manifestation of the control he was trying to exert. Let go, I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. He realized where we were and yanked his hand back, shoving it into his pocket. "Just pay, Sarah. I'll transfer you the money tonight. I had a glitch with the bank. It's a security thing. High-limit accounts get flagged for unusual activity." The lie tasted like ash. I knew his bank. I knew how he handled money, or how he used to. But the line was getting longer, and the social pressure was a crushing weight. With a shaking hand, I pulled out my own debit card, my personal bucket card. I swiped it. Transaction approved. The sound of the receipt printing felt like the sound of a judge's gavel. I had just spent nearly my entire month's discretionary income on Wagyu sliders and artisan cheese for a party I didn't want, for a husband I realized I didn't know. The drive home was a suffocating void of silence. Mark stared out the window, his phone vibrating incessantly in his lap. Every time it buzzed, his posture stiffened. He didn't offer to help with the bags when we got to the house, our beautiful, renovated colonial that now felt like a stage set for a play that had gone off script. I hauled the groceries into the kitchen, my breath coming in ragged hitches. I started shoving things into the fridge, not caring where they landed. Quote 51, Mark said, walking in and leaning against the counter as if nothing had happened. Quote 52, I stopped. A jar of olives in my hand. I turned slowly to face him. Quote 53, quote 54, quote 55. Mark rolled his eyes, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a slap. He shouted, his face suddenly contorted with a rage I'd never seen. He turned on his heel and marched toward his home office, slamming the door so hard the framed wedding photo in the hallway rattled on its hook. I stood in the kitchen, trembling. The tear. The word felt like a cult mantra. I looked at the Wagyu beef sitting on the counter. It was graying slightly at the edges. I felt a sudden violent urge to throw it out the window. Instead, I did something I had promised I would never do. I went to the hallway and looked at the wedding photo. Behind it, on the wall, was the small keypad for our home safe. We both had the code. We used it for our passports and the deed to the house. I punched in the numbers, our anniversary, and the door clicked open. I wasn't looking for jewelry. I was looking for the split budget folder. Mark kept all our joint financial records in there. He was meticulous about it, often spending hours on Sunday nights updating his spreadsheets. He said it was for transparency, but I realize now I hadn't actually looked inside that folder in weeks. I pulled out the heavy blue binder. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I flipped past the mortgage documents, past the utility bills, to the section labeled Joint Household Account. This was the account where we both deposited our share for the house. My $2,000 and his $4, $500 every month. It was supposed to be the safety net. I stared at the latest statement. The balance wasn't $15,000, which is what it should have been after the recent renovations. It was $14.12. There were dozens of withdrawals over the last month, large, round numbers, 500 here, 1,000 there. All of them transferred out to an account I didn't recognize, an account with a string of letters and numbers that looked like an offshore entity or a private holding company. But that wasn't the worst part. I flipped further back and found a letter from our mortgage lender. It was dated 2 weeks ago. Notice of default. We were 3 months behind on the mortgage. Mark had been taking my $2,000 every month, plus his own contribution, and sending it somewhere else. He had been lying to my face every morning while we drank coffee in a kitchen we were about to lose. A cold, numbing horror washed over me. The split budget wasn't about empowerment. It was a smokescreen. By keeping our finances separate, he had ensured I wouldn't see the hole he was digging until we were already buried in it. I heard the office door open. I scrambled to shove the binder back into the safe, but I was too slow. "What are you doing?" Mark was standing at the end of the hallway. He wasn't angry anymore. He looked pale, his eyes darting to the open safe and then to my face. Quote 65, I whispered, the binder still in my hands. Quote 66. He didn't move. He didn't apologize. He just looked at the binder like it was a weapon I was holding. Quote, 67, quote 68, quote 69. He stepped toward me, his voice rising in pitch, quote 70, quote 71. I said, reaching for my phone, my brother is a forensic accountant, quote 72. Mark moved faster than I thought he could. He lunged forward, grabbing my phone out of my hand and slamming the safe door shut, trapping the binder inside. Quote 73, he hissed, his face inches from mine. Quote 74. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. Quote 75, Mark said, his expression instantly shifting into a terrifying, polished mask of a successful man. He smoothed his shirt and adjusted his watch. Quote 76. I walked back to the kitchen, my mind racing. I looked at the Wagyu beef, then at the back door. I could run. I could just leave. But he had my phone. He had the safe code. He had everything. I picked up the knife to start chopping the onions, my tears blurring my vision. I felt like a prisoner in my own life. But then I heard voices in the foyer, not the loud, boisterous greetings of Mark's, quote 77. These voices were low, professional, and authoritative. Quote 78, a deep voice asked. Quote 79, quote 80. Mark's voice sounded small. Quote 81, quote 82. I dropped the knife. It clattered against the granite. I walked to the kitchen door and looked out into the hallway. 2 men in suits were standing there, and behind them, a third man was holding a pair of handcuffs. But it wasn't the handcuffs that made my blood run cold. It was the woman standing behind the officers. She was dressed in an expensive silk suit, holding a briefcase, and she looked exactly like the woman in the happy anniversary photo I'd found hidden in Mark's drawer a year ago, the one he claimed was just a stock photo that came with the frame. She looked at Mark, then her eyes shifted to me. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "Hello, Sarah," she said. "I've been waiting for us to finally meet. I believe you have something of mine." The air in the foyer turned frozen. Mark looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting from the officers to the woman in the silk suit. He looked at me, his face pale and slick with sweat, but there was no apology in his eyes, only a desperate, flickering calculation. "Elena?" Mark's voice was a brittle rasp. "What is this? This is a misunderstanding. We were supposed to close on the agreement Monday." The woman, Elena, stepped into the house as if she already owned it. She didn't look at Mark. Her eyes were fixed on the colonial molding, the expensive hardwood floors, and finally, me. She was elegant in a way that felt like a sharpened blade. "There is no Monday, Mark," she said, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. "The board found the discrepancy in the quarterly filing this morning, and then I found the offshore accounts you opened in Sarah's name." The world tilted on its axis. "In my name?" "I didn't open any accounts," I stammered, stepping forward. I felt the knife I'd dropped earlier still lingering in my mind, a symbol of the domestic life that had just been incinerated. "I don't even have access to his main bank. We have a split budget. We're financially independent." Elena turned her head slightly, a look of genuine pity crossing her face. It was the kind of look you give a dog that's been kicked too many times to know it's hurt. "Oh, honey," she whispered. "The split budget wasn't for independence, it was for insulation. He needed a paper trail of you being the primary spender for the household. He needed your signatures on those joint forms to look like you were the one managing the flow of cash." The officers moved in then. One of them, a man with a graying mustache and a badge that gleamed like a cold eye, stepped toward Mark. "Mark Sterling, you're being detained pending a formal arrest for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent." Mark didn't go quietly. As the officer reached for his arm, Mark lunged, not for the door, but for me. He grabbed my shoulders, his fingers digging into my skin. "Tell them, Sarah," he hissed, his face inches from mine. I could smell the expensive scotch he'd been drinking earlier. Tell them you handle the finances. Tell them the split budget was your idea. If you take the fall, the money in the trust is still yours. It's enough for 3 lifetimes. Just tell them you did it. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. The man I had loved, the man who had insisted I pay for my own groceries while he, quote, 87, quote, was now asking me to go to prison so he could keep his, quote, 88, quote. Get off her, the officer commanded, pulling Mark away and slamming him against the wall. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most satisfying noise I'd ever heard, yet it was drowned out by the roaring in my ears. As Mark was led toward the door, shouting about lawyers and, quote, 89, the second officer remained behind with Elena. He turned to me, his expression softening slightly. Mrs. Sterling, we have a warrant to search the premises. We're looking for a physical ledger and several hardware wallets. Your husband's digital footprint shows he moved over $4 million in the last 48 hours. We believe the access keys are hidden somewhere in this house. I don't know anything about hardware wallets, I said, my voice shaking. I was just making sliders. Elena walked past the officer and into the kitchen. She looked at the $462 worth of groceries scattered across the counter. She picked up a package of the Wagyu sliders I'd bled my bank account dry to buy. Nice choice, she said, turning the package over in her gloved hands. But a bit excessive for a man who claimed to be broke this morning, don't you think? He made me buy those, I said, my voice rising. He made me pay for everything. He told me he was at a different tier. He told me I was being petty for asking him to help with the bill. Elena paused. She looked at the sliders again, then at the artisanal crackers and the $42 cheese. A frown creased her perfect brow. She set the meat down and walked toward the refrigerator, opening it. She began pulling things out, the organic milk, the imported olives, the high-end butter. Officer Miller, she called out, her voice sharp. Check the expiration dates on these. The officer confusedly stepped over. The expiration dates? Ma'am, we're looking for millions of dollars, not spoiled milk. Just look. She insisted. I watched, bewildered, as the officer picked up the milk I'd bought just an hour ago. Sell, buy. Next year? Wait, this isn't milk. This carton is weighted. He unscrewed the cap. Instead of white liquid, he pulled out a vacuum-sealed plastic bag filled with what looked like encrypted USB drives and stacks of high-denomination bills. My jaw dropped. The groceries. Mark hadn't just been being a jerk about the budget. He hadn't been making me pay because he was stingy. He was using me to smuggle the evidence into the house. By making me do the shopping, by making me use my own card and my own bags, he had ensured that if anyone was watching the house, it was me who brought the stolen assets through the front door. The Wagyu beef, the cheese, the milk. They were all hollowed-out shells, containers for the life he was stealing from his company. And he had made me pay for the privilege of being his mule. There's more, Officer Miller said, reaching into the bag of artisanal crackers. He pulled out a small leather-bound book. He flipped it open. It's a ledger, names, dates, and... oh boy. Elena leaned over to look. Her face went pale. That's not just corporate money. Those are names of people you don't want to owe money to, officer. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a new kind of terror. Sarah, did Mark ever mention a man named the Architect? I shook my head, my mind reeling. No. He just talked about the guys coming over for the game. He said he needed to host them properly. Elena's hand went to her throat. The guys aren't his co-workers, Sarah. They're the creditors. And if the money is in this house, and the DA is in this house... Before she could finish, the front door, which had been left ajar by the officers, swung open with a violent thud. 3 men walked in. They weren't wearing suits, and they didn't have badges. They were wearing heavy tactical vests, and they were carrying silent submachine guns. The officer didn't even have time to reach for his holster. One of the men raised his weapon and fired a single muffled shot into the ceiling. "Nobody moves," the lead man said. He had a scarred throat and eyes like flat gray stones. He looked at the groceries on the counter, then at the ledger in the officer's hand. "We're here for the split," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. And since Mark didn't mention the police would be joining the party, the budget just changed. He turned his gaze to me, the man who had supposedly been _90_Mark. "You're the wife," he said, "the one who paid for all this, which means you're the one who knows the secondary code for the hardware wallets." "I don't," I screamed. "I don't know anything. I just bought the groceries." The man stepped closer, the barrel of the gun cold against my forehead. "Mark said his wife was the brains of the operation," the man said, a grim smile spreading across his face. "He said you were the one who came up with the split budget to hide the trail. He said you were the one holding the keys." I looked toward the door, praying to see Mark, praying for him to tell them the truth, but the hallway was empty. Mark was already in the back of a squad car, probably blocks away by now, leaving me behind to answer for a life I hadn't even known I was living. "I'll ask you one more time, darling," the man said, clicking the safety off. "Where is the rest of the money, or do I start with the woman in the silk suit?" At that exact moment, my phone, the one Mark had snatched and I had managed to grab back in the chaos, vibrated in my pocket. I looked down at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "The back door is unlocked. The car is running. If you want to live, leave the ledger and run. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'll make it up to you at the next tier." The man with the gun saw the light of the screen. "Who is that?" He reached for the phone, but as he did, a deafening explosion rocked the back of the house, blowing the kitchen windows inward in a shower of glass and fire. The roar of the explosion was a physical blow. It felt like a wall of solid air slammed into my chest, throwing me backward over the kitchen island. For a few seconds, the world was nothing but a high-pitched ringing and the smell of ozone, scorched meat, and ancient dust. I blinked, my vision swimming. The kitchen was a nightmare. The back wall where the sliding glass doors had been was gone, replaced by a jagged hole and a plume of thick black smoke. The man with the scarred throat was on his knees, clutching his head, his submachine gun lying several feet away in a pile of shattered artisanal crackers. "Sarah!" I heard a scream and realized it was Elena. She was pinned under a heavy oak chair, her silk suit ruined, her face smeared with soot. Officer Miller was motionless near the foyer, his body half covered by the fallen hallway coat rack. My phone was still in my hand. The screen was cracked, but the text message from Mark was still visible, glowing like a malevolent coal. "The back door is unlocked. The car is running." I looked at the hole in the back of the house. Beyond the smoke, I could see the glow of taillights in the alleyway. The man with the gun began to stir. He groped for his weapon, his gray eyes fixing on me with a sudden murderous clarity. I didn't think. I couldn't afford to. My personal bucket was empty. My marriage was a lie, and my house was a crime scene. I had nothing left to lose but my life. I lunged across the floor, grabbing the leather-bound ledger that had fallen from Officer Miller's hand during the blast. If this was the split everyone was dying for, I wasn't leaving it for the men who had just tried to put a bullet in my brain. "Hey!" the gunman croaked, reaching for my ankle. I kicked him squarely in the face with my sensible grocery shopping flats and scrambled toward the ruins of the back door. I vaulted over a pile of flaming drywall, the heat singeing the hair on my arms. I burst into the cool night air. The alleyway was choked with smoke, but there it was, a black sedan, engine idling with a low, predatory hum. The driver's side window was tinted dark. I ran to the passenger door and yanked it open, throwing myself inside. "Go, just go!" I screamed, clutching the ledger to my chest. The car didn't move. The driver didn't even put it into gear. I turned, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see Mark's panicked, handsome face. I expected him to tell me it was all part of the plan, that we were going to the _93_ together. Instead, I was looking into the barrel of a suppressed pistol. The driver wasn't Mark. It was a woman I'd never seen before, wearing a headset and a tactical earpiece. She looked like she belonged on a private security detail. "The ledger," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "And the hardware wallets. Now." "Where is Mark?" I gasped, my fingers tightening on the book. "He sent the text. He said he'd make it up to me." The woman's lips curled into a tiny, cruel smile. "Mark is currently negotiating his cooperation with the DA. Part of that cooperation involved delivering the mastermind behind the embezzlement. Do you know who that is, Sarah?" A cold dread, deeper than anything I'd felt in the grocery store or the kitchen, washed over me. "He told them it was me," I whispered. "The split budget," she said, and for the first time I heard a hint of amusement in her tone. "It wasn't just a way to hide money, it was a legal restructure. 3 months ago, Mark had you sign those empowerment papers. You didn't read the fine print, did you? You signed a power of attorney and a corporate resolution naming you as the sole officer of the shell company that received the stolen funds." I remembered the night at the dining table, the scotch, the spreadsheets. "It's about empowerment, Sarah. You keep what you earn. We're adults." I had signed those papers thinking I was gaining independence. Instead, I had signed a confession. Mark had spent 3 months making sure every single cent of stolen money was tied to my name, my card, and my signatures. He had played the part of the struggling husband while painting me as the greedy, high-spending architect of the fraud. "He's giving them the ledger," I realized, looking at the book in my lap. "No, he's giving them me holding the ledger." "Exactly," the woman said. "But my employers, the ones Mark actually owes money to, don't care about your legal drama. They just want their $4 million. And since you're the CEO, you're going to tell me exactly where the digital keys are hidden." "I don't know," I yelled, tears finally spilling over. "I don't have the keys. I just have the groceries." "The groceries," the woman repeated. She looked at the singed bag I'd subconsciously dragged into the car with me. Inside, the $42 wedge of Pecorino Romano sat nestled against a stack of blood-stained bills. She reached over and snatched the cheese. She didn't look at it. She squeezed it. The expensive aged cheese didn't crumble. It clicked. She twisted the wedge and the top half came off like a lid. Inside, embedded in a block of high-density foam, was a small, sleek device with a digital display. It was a cold storage crypto wallet. "Found it," she said. She turned the device on. The screen flickered to life, asking for a 24-word recovery phrase. "Now," she said, pressing the gun against my ribs. "Mark said the password was something only you would know, something about your first investment together." I froze. My mind raced back 10 years. The $12 sparkling wine, the studio apartment, the ramen, none of those felt right. Mark didn't care about those things. He'd spent the last year trying to erase them. "I don't know it," I sobbed. "I swear." The woman sighed and tapped her earpiece. "Target is non-compliant, moving to phase 2. She put the car into drive and slammed her foot on the accelerator. We roared out of the alley just as police sirens began to wail in the distance. "Where are we going?" I shrieked. "To see Mark," she said. "He's waiting for us at the airfield. He thought he was flying to the Caymans alone. He's going to be very surprised to see his business partner joining him." As we sped through the city, my phone buzzed one last time. It was a notification from our joint banking app. New transfer, $462.88. Mark had finally, quote, 95 me for the groceries. But as the car pulled onto a dark private tarmac where a small jet was idling, I saw Mark standing near the stairs. He wasn't in handcuffs. He was holding a briefcase talking to a man in a dark overcoat. He looked up as the car skidded to a halt. When he saw me in the passenger seat, his face didn't show guilt. It didn't show fear. He checked his watch, looked at the man in the overcoat, and nodded. The woman beside me opened her door and dragged me out of the car by my hair. She shoved me toward Mark. I fell onto the cold asphalt at his feet. "Sarah," Mark said, looking down at me. He looked perfectly polished, the chaos of the house a million miles away. "I told you. A split budget means you use your own money, and today your money just bought me a brand new life." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But the architect doesn't like loose ends, darling, and unfortunately for you, there's one part of the budget we didn't split." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black detonator. "The house was just the beginning," he said. "Tell me, Sarah, did you remember to take your wedding ring off before you left the kitchen?" I looked down at my hand. The diamond ring, the one he'd upgraded last month to fit the tier, was glowing with a faint, rhythmic red light I had never noticed before. I stared at the pulsing red light on my finger, the rhythmic throb of it feeling like a countdown. My mind, sharp and cold despite the terror, finally connected the dots. Mark hadn't just upgraded my ring to show off his new tier. He had replaced my original diamond with a synthetic stone embedded with a GPS transponder and a microcharge. "You're a monster," I whispered, my voice cracking in the wind of the tarmac. "No, Sarah," Mark said, checking his watch again. "I'm a strategist. You are the perfect partner for the ascent, but you're a liability for the destination. The DA thinks you're the mastermind. The architect thinks you're the holder of the keys. And in about 60 seconds, the world is going to think you died in a tragic accident involving a fleeing suspect and a faulty fuel line." The woman from the car stepped back, her job done. The man in the overcoat, presumably a representative of the architect, looked on with clinical indifference. "The password, Mark," the man in the overcoat said. "The woman first, then the password." Mark turned to me, his smile as fake as the life he'd built. "The password, darling. One last contribution to the household budget." I looked at the ring, then at Mark. I thought about the 3 years of our money, the 3 months of his money, and the $42 cheese that held $1 million secret. I thought about how he'd called me petty for wanting to be treated like a human being. "You really think I didn't notice, Mark?" I said, my voice suddenly steady. Mark paused. "Notice what?" "The glitches." "I'm a graphic designer, Mark. I spend 10 hours a day looking at pixels and metadata. When you gave me those split-budget spreadsheets to sign, you didn't think I'd actually look at the file history, did you?" Mark's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "You're so obsessed with your tier that you forgot I have my own skills. I saw the hidden layers in the PDF. I saw the links to the offshore accounts you were setting up in my name weeks before you even proposed the split. I knew you were framing me the moment you mentioned financial autonomy." I stood up, wiping the soot from my face. I didn't look like a victim anymore. I looked like a woman who had been meal planning for a war. I continued. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was shattered, but the biometric sensor still worked. I pressed my thumb to it. _ quote _114 _. I looked at the man in the overcoat. Quote 115. The man in the overcoat shifted his gaze to Mark. The temperature of the encounter dropped 20 degrees. Quote 116. The man said, his voice like grinding stones. Quote 117. Quote 118. Mark shouted, his face reddening. Quote 119. Quote 120. I stepped toward the plane, the red light on my ring pulsing faster. Quote 121. The sound of sirens began to swell in the distance, but they weren't coming from the city. They were coming from the perimeter of the airfield. Blue and red lights cut through the darkness, reflecting off the silver belly of the jet. Mark panicked. He looked at the detonator in his hand, then at me. "I'll do it, Sarah. I'll end it right now." "Then you'll die too," I said. "Because the tracker in this ring? I didn't just leave it there. While you were in the shower this morning, I realized the tier of this diamond was a bit off. I did a little design work of my own." I held up my hand. I swapped the stones. Mark, the one on my finger is just a piece of glass from a costume shop. The one with the transponder? The one that's linked to that detonator? I pointed to the briefcase Mark was clutching. I tucked it into the lining of your bag while you were busy telling me to make the sliders. Mark's face went from red to a ghostly, translucent white. He looked down at the briefcase. The faint, rhythmic red pulse was visible through the expensive leather. The man in the overcoat didn't wait. He knew when a _127_ had collapsed. He turned and bolted toward a second vehicle idling in the shadows, leaving Mark alone on the tarmac. The woman from the car followed, disappearing into the night. Mark stood there, frozen, holding the detonator that was now a master key to his own destruction. Quote 128, he whimpered. Quote 129, quote 130. I said, backing away toward the approaching police lights, quote 131. The police swarmed the tarmac, a sea of black tactical gear and shouting voices. Elena was among them, looking remarkably composed for someone who had just survived an explosion. She stepped up to me, draped a shock blanket over my shoulders, and took the ledger from my hands. Quote, 132, she said. I watched as they tackled Mark to the ground. They pried the detonator from his hand and the briefcase from his grip. He was screaming about, quote, 133 and, quote, 134 and, quote, 135. But the wind swallowed his words until they were nothing but noise. As they led him away, Elena turned to me. She leaned in, a small, genuine smile on her face. I looked at the jet, then at the ruins of my life, and finally at the empty space on my finger where the ring had been. I felt lighter than I had in years. A week later, I stood in a different grocery store. It was quiet, brightly lit, and peaceful. I walked down the aisle, picking up a simple carton of milk, some fresh bread, and a small, reasonably priced block of cheddar. I reached the checkout. The total was $15.64. I pulled out my card, my own card, and swiped it. Quote, 138, the cashier asked. Quote, 139. I said, tucking it into my wallet. Quote, 140. I walked out into the sunlight, a free woman with a full heart and a very, very healthy budget. Mark was right about one thing. Empowerment really is a beautiful thing. You just have to be willing to pay the price for it yourself. Image prompts. 1. A cinematic close-up of a woman's trembling hands holding an open carton of organic milk, where instead of milk, thick bundles of $100 bills and encrypted USB drives are spilling out onto a luxury granite kitchen counter. Hyper-realistic, dramatic lighting, 8K resolution. 2. A high-stakes scene in a luxury grocery store aisle. A husband in an expensive suit stands coldly in the background looking at his phone, while his wife in the foreground stares in shock at a block of artisanal cheese that has been sliced open to reveal a hidden, digital tracking device. Realistic style, cinematic depth of field. 3. A dramatic night shot of a woman standing in front of a burning luxury colonial mansion. Her face covered in soot, but her expression determined. She is clutching a leather-bound ledger to her chest, while police sirens and red and blue lights reflect off the smoke. Hyper-realistic, intense atmosphere. 4. A cinematic showdown at a dark, rain-slicked, private airfield. A woman stands defiantly in the foreground, holding up a glowing diamond ring that pulses with a red light, while a man in a suit looks on in terror next to a private jet. High contrast, rim lighting, realistic textures.